Alexandria, Egypt, March 24, 1941. A duty officer places a single sheet of paper on Admiral Andrew Cunningham's desk. The decrypt is marked Ultra, Britain's most closely guarded secret. Italian battle fleet sortie imminent. Target: British convoy routes to Greece. In the harbor below, supply ships wait with engines ticking, their holds packed with ammunition and rations for troops already fighting in the mountains. The Royal Navy has kept these lanes open for months, but now the entire Italian battle line is coming to cut them. Cunningham studies the plotting table. His 3 battleships, Warspite, Valiant, Barham, carry 15-inch guns and decades of tradition. But they also carry something the Italians do not yet understand. In the radar huts, young operators watch green phosphor screens, tracking targets beyond the reach of human eyes. The Italians believe the British fleet is still in port. They are wrong. 8 hours wrong. This is the story of how electrons defeated steel. The Mediterranean in March 1941 was a sea of calculated risk. British supply lines to Greece stretched across 600 miles of water patrolled by Italian submarines and German aircraft. Every convoy was a gamble. Every escort a diversion from other urgent duties. And now, Ultra intercepts confirmed what British naval intelligence had feared. The Regia Marina was committing its heavy units to sever those lifelines entirely. Admiral Andrew Cunningham commanded the Mediterranean fleet from his flagship. He was 58 years old, a career officer who had learned his trade in the trenches of destroyer warfare during the Great War. He understood night action. He understood risk. And he understood that the Italians were sailing into a battle they thought they controlled. The Italian plan was straightforward. Admiral Angelo Iacchino would lead the battleship Vittorio Veneto, 6 heavy cruisers, and 13 destroyers from Taranto toward the convoy routes south of Crete. The battle line would intercept British transports at dawn, shell them at range, and withdraw before the Royal Navy could concentrate its scattered forces. Supermarina, the Italian Naval High Command in Rome, had calculated the timing carefully. British battleships, they believed, were tied to Alexandria. Response time: 36 hours minimum. They were mistaken. Cunningham sailed within 4 hours of receiving the Ultra decrypt. The British battle line consisted of 3 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships, Warspite, Valiant, and Barham. Each displaced 31,000 tons. Each mounted 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. These were not new ships. All 3 had been laid down before 1913, but they had been modernized, refitted, and equipped with the most advanced fire control systems in any navy. More importantly, they carried radar. Type 284 gunnery radar operated at approximately 200 MHz, with a wavelength of 1.5 meters. Effective range: 25,000 yards under optimal conditions, with bearing accuracy to within 1 degree and range accuracy to within 200 yards. This was not experimental technology. It was operational, tested, and integrated into the high-angle control system that directed the main battery fire. For the first time in naval history, a fleet could measure the range to an enemy ship in total darkness without firing a single ranging shot. The Italians had no equivalent. Regia Marina doctrine emphasized daylight fleet engagements with rigid station-keeping and synchronized gunnery. Night fighting was considered too chaotic, too dependent on chance illumination by star shell or searchlight. Italian rangefinders were excellent, among the best optical instruments in the world, but they required a visible target. At night, that meant waiting for the enemy to reveal himself first. Cunningham's force also included the aircraft carrier Formidable. She embarked squadrons 826 and 829 of the Fleet Air Arm, flying Ferry Albacore torpedo bombers. These were slow, fabric-covered biplanes with open cockpits and a cruising speed of 90 knots. But they could carry an 18-inch torpedo, and they could operate at night. The reconnaissance reports they would provide over the next 3 days would shape the entire battle. By nightfall on March 25th, the British Mediterranean fleet was at sea, steaming northwest at 20 knots. The Italians still believed it was in port. The British advantage was not merely technological. It was doctrinal, cultural, and institutional. The Royal Navy had been preparing for night action since the 1920s. Monthly exercises required capital ships to engage targets after dark using director control, predictive fire, and coordinated illumination. Gunnery officers were trained to manage star shell patterns, to estimate ranges from bearing rates, and to build firing solutions under conditions of partial visibility. By 1941, this was not a theory. It was reflex. The Italians trained differently. Regia Marina tactical publications emphasized formation integrity and concentrated fire during daylight hours. Night engagements were treated as aberrations, situations to be avoided rather than mastered. Italian destroyers practiced torpedo attacks at night, but heavy units were expected to disengage before darkness fell. This was not cowardice. It was a rational calculation based on optical gunnery. If you cannot see the target, you cannot hit it. The British had changed the equation. Type 284 radar did not make the British infallible. It was temperamental, sensitive to sea state, and required skilled operators to interpret the phosphor traces on the cathode ray tube. But it removed the single greatest limitation of naval gunnery: the need to see the enemy. A radar plot could provide bearing and range continuously, updating every few seconds, feeding directly into the mechanical computers that calculated deflection, elevation, and time of flight. The human eye could be deceived by haze, smoke, or darkness. The electron beam could not. On March 26, reconnaissance aircraft from Formidable located the Italian fleet south of Crete. Iachino was proceeding as planned, unaware that British capital ships were already within striking range. Cunningham ordered an airstrike. At 1100 hours, 6 albacores attacked Vittorio Veneto with torpedoes. One struck aft, damaging the battleship's port outboard propeller shaft and flooding 2 compartments. Speed dropped from 30 knots to 19, then slowly recovered to 20 as damage control teams isolated the flooded spaces. Iachino now faced a decision. His flagship was damaged but operational. He could continue the mission, trusting that British surface units were still too far away to intervene. Or he could withdraw, preserving his force but abandoning the operation. He chose withdrawal. At 1400 hours, the Italian fleet turned northwest, heading for Taranto at reduced speed. Vittorio Veneto would make it home, but 3 of her escorts would not. At 1500 hours, a second airstrike from Formidable attacked the retreating Italian column. This time, the target was the heavy cruiser Pola. The torpedo struck amidships, destroying her starboard engine room and severing electrical mains. Pola lost all power. She drifted to a halt, dead in the water, 300 miles from the nearest friendly port. Iachino received the signal at 1530 hours. One of his heavy cruisers was crippled and helpless. Standard procedure required him to detach escorts to assist. But standard procedure assumed daylight recovery. It was now late afternoon. By the time destroyers reached Pola, it would be dark. And somewhere to the south, British battleships were closing. He made his choice. At 1600 hours, Iachino ordered the 1st Division, heavy cruisers Zara and Fiume and 4 destroyers, to return to Pola, take her in tow if possible, or evacuate her crew if necessary. The rest of the fleet would continue to Taranto. The detached division would follow when ready. It was a logical order. It was also a death sentence. By 1800 hours, Cunningham knew exactly where Pola was. Reconnaissance aircraft had her position fixed to within 1 mile. The British battle line altered course to intercept. Warspite, Valiant, and Barham would approach from the south, with destroyers screening ahead and on the flanks. Formidable would remain to the east, out of gun range, ready to launch illumination aircraft if needed. The cruiser squadron would sweep wide to prevent any Italian units from escaping to the north. The Mediterranean night fell quickly. By 2000 hours, visibility was less than 3,000 yards. Sea state, calm. Moon new. Cloud cover. Scattered. Ideal conditions for radar. Impossible conditions for optical gunnery. At 2100 hours, British radar detected 3 large contacts bearing 320 degrees, range 14,000 yards. The contacts were stationary. One was Pola, still drifting without power. The other 2 were Zara and Fiume, who stopped alongside to begin the evacuation. Cunningham ordered the battle line to close at 15 knots. Turrets trained to port. Rangekeepers are updated continuously from the radar plot. No searchlights. No star shell. No indication of British presence. The Italians saw nothing. At 2200 hours, British destroyers probing ahead made visual contact with a stationary ship. It was Pola. Searchlights stabbed across the water, illuminating her hull and superstructure. Italian sailors, still attempting repairs, stared into the sudden glare. Some waved. They thought the destroyers were Italian. Cunningham now had a choice. He could order the destroyers to torpedo Pola immediately, eliminating the crippled cruiser and withdrawing before the Italian escort force arrived. Or he could wait. The radar plot showed 2 more large contacts 4 miles northwest of Pola, approaching slowly. If those were heavy cruisers, and Cunningham believed they were, then they were sailing directly toward the British battle line. In darkness, without radar, unaware that 3 15-inch gun battleships were less than 5 miles away. He waited. At 22:15 hours, Zara and Fiume reached Pola. They slowed to 5 knots, maneuvering to come alongside. Damage control parties prepared tow lines. Lifeboats were readied in case evacuation became necessary. Lookouts scanned the horizon, alert for British ships. They saw nothing. The Mediterranean night was empty, silent, and profoundly dark. On Warspite, radar operators tracked every movement. Range to the Italian cruisers, 8,000 yards. Speed, 5 knots. Bearing, steady. The targets were not maneuvering. They were not alerted. They were not even aware they were being tracked. Commander R.H. Stannard, in the Director Control Tower, watched the ranges update every few seconds. Deflection computed. Elevation set. Salvos ready. He waited for the order. Cunningham gave it at 22:27 hours. Open fire. The first broadside from Warspite, Valiant, and Barham arrived without warning. 24 15-inch shells, each weighing 1,938 pounds, crossed the darkness at 2,600 feet per second. Time of flight, 14 seconds. The Italians never saw them coming. Fiume was hit first. 3 shells struck her starboard side between the forward turrets and the bridge. The armor-piercing rounds penetrated the belt armor, detonated inside the hull, and ignited ready ammunition in the forward magazines. The explosion tore off her bow. Secondary detonations followed as fires spread. Within 90 seconds, Fiume was heeling to starboard, her foredeck already underwater. Zara, 400 yards astern, took the second salvo. 5 shells hit within 3 seconds. One demolished her forward fire control station. Another penetrated the bridge, killing or wounding everyone inside. A third detonated in the forward engine room, severing steam lines and filling the compartment with superheated vapor. Zara lost power, lost steering, and began a slow turn to port out of control. The Italian destroyers attempted to respond. Vittorio Alfieri launched torpedoes on a reciprocal bearing, hoping to hit whatever was firing from the darkness. She never completed the spread. A 6-inch shell from Valiant's secondary battery struck her forward magazine. The explosion broke her back. She sank in less than 2 minutes. Destroyer Carducci tried to lay smoke. A 15-inch shell hit her amidships, cutting her in half. Both sections remained afloat for several minutes before capsizing. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. In that time, the British fired approximately 150 main battery shells and an unknown number of secondary rounds. Italian return fire, 0. Not a single Italian gun fired at the British battle line. They never acquired a target. At 22:36 hours, Cunningham ordered a ceasefire. Zara was burning from stem to stern. Fiume had capsized and sunk. 2 Italian destroyers were gone. Pola remained dead in the water, untouched by British guns but now completely isolated. British casualties? None. British ships damaged? None. It was the most one-sided surface action in modern naval history. But the statistics alone did not capture the experience. On Valiant's bridge, junior officers watched the gun flashes ripple along the battle line, 24 orange blooms of light, synchronized to within seconds, followed by the rolling thunder of the discharge. Then silence. Then, for miles away, the bright white flashes of impacts. Shell splashes rose like geysers, pale against the night. Then the orange glow of fires. All of this was observed from a ship the enemy could not see, could not locate, could not engage. The Italian experience was opposite and absolute. Survivors later described the sequence in testimonies taken over the following weeks. First, confusion. Lookouts reported flashes on the starboard beam, bearing uncertain, range unknown. Bridge officers ordered general quarters, but before the alarm could sound throughout the ship, the first salvo arrived. 15-inch shells punched through Fiume's armor belt at 3,800 yards, nearly point-blank range for weapons of that caliber. Penetration was total. Detonation occurred inside the hull, in machinery spaces, ammunition passages, crew berthing areas. The explosions were not external. They were internal. The ship was being destroyed from within. On Zara, the gunnery officer attempted to direct fire at the muzzle flashes. He ordered turrets to train on the bearing of the last observed flash. But the flashes were brief, irregular, and gave no indication of range. Italian optical rangefinders swung across empty darkness. There was nothing to measure.
No silhouette.
No shape. No reference point. The gunnery solution could not be computed because there was no target. Only flashes. And by the time turrets trained to the approximate bearing, another salvo arrived. This one struck Zara's bridge directly. The gunnery officer was killed instantly. So was the captain. So were most of the bridge crew. Radar had compressed time itself. In a conventional night action, first contact would trigger a sequence of events. Visual sighting, bearing estimation, range estimation by optical rangefinder, calculation of deflection and time of flight, turret training, salvo fire. Elapsed time, 2 to 3 minutes, assuming competent gunnery control. And the first salvo would almost certainly miss, because optical rangefinding at night was inherently inaccurate. A second salvo would follow, adjusted for the fall of shot observed in the target splash. Third salvo, fourth salvo, gradually walking the fire onto the target. Total time to first hit, 5 to 7 minutes. With radar, the sequence collapsed. Bearing and range were known continuously, updated every few seconds. Deflection and time of flight were computed mechanically, adjusted for own ship motion and target motion. Turrets trained smoothly to the predicted bearing. When the order came, the guns were already aimed. First salvo straddle. Second salvo hit. Time to first hit, under 1 minute. The Italians had trained for a different kind of battle. In daylight, with optical rangefinders and director control, Regia Marina gunnery was excellent. Italian cruisers regularly scored hits at 15,000 yards during peacetime exercises. Their ships were fast, well-armored, and equipped with outstanding optics. But none of that mattered in total darkness against an enemy who could see without light. The British fire control solution was elegant. Type 284 radar provided range and bearing to the target. The Admiralty Fire Control Table, a mechanical analog computer, accepted those inputs along with own ship course and speed, target course and speed, wind, and ballistic data. It computed the required gun elevation and deflection, transmitting those values electrically to the turrets. Gunners matched pointers on dials. When the pointers aligned, the guns were aimed. The entire system operated continuously, updating in real time as the tactical situation changed. The result was a weapon system that functioned as well at night as during the day. Better, in some respects, because darkness eliminated the visual confusion of smoke, haze, and shell splashes. The radar return was clean. The fire control solution was precise. The guns fired blindly, but they fired accurately. Italian doctrine had no answer. Star shells required a bearing to illuminate. Searchlights revealed your own position. Optical rangefinders required a visible silhouette. Remove visibility, and the entire gunnery system collapsed. Training, experience, and courage became irrelevant. You cannot hit what you cannot see. And if the enemy can see you when you cannot see him, the outcome is predetermined. At 2300 hours, British destroyers closed on the burning wrecks. Fires illuminated the scene. Zara was settling by the bow, her stern rising as the forward compartments flooded. Fiume had vanished entirely, leaving only an oil slick and scattered debris. Hundreds of Italian sailors were in the water, clinging to wreckage or swimming toward the destroyers. British crews threw scrambling nets over the side and began pulling survivors aboard. Among those rescued was a lieutenant from Zara's gunnery department. He was interrogated briefly that night and more extensively over the following days. His testimony was precise and chilling. We saw white flashes, very bright, from no direction we could identify. Then the shells arrived. We attempted to train our guns on the bearing of the flashes, but we saw no ships. Nothing. Only flashes and then impacts. Our bridge was destroyed in the second salvo. I do not know if any of our guns fired. I think not. There was no target. This statement appeared in multiple after-action reports. It was corroborated by dozens of other survivors. The Italians never saw the British ships. Not once. They saw muzzle flashes, bright, orange-white blooms of light, 3 or 4 miles distant, and then impacts. The enemy was invisible. The guns that killed Zara and Fiume fired from a position the Italians could not locate, could not target, and could not engage. Inside Warspite's radar hut, the atmosphere was professional and oddly calm. Petty Officer Thomas Miller, age 23, had been trained on Type 284 for 6 months. He had practiced tracking exercises in Alexandria harbor, followed merchant ships entering and leaving port, and participated in night drills off the Egyptian coast. But this was his first combat action. He watched the cathode ray tube intently, noting the 3 bright returns that represented Italian cruisers. Range decreasing, bearing steady. He called out updates every 10 seconds, his voice carried by voice tube to the director control tower above. Range 7,800. Bearing 320. Closing. Range 7,600. Bearing 320. Closing. Range 7,200. Bearing 318. Closing. The returns were strong and clear.
No clatter. No interference.
The Italian ships were large, metal, and moving slowly. Perfect radar targets. Miller did not know what ships they were. He did not know whether they were aware of Warspite's presence. He knew only that he was tracking them, that his data was feeding the fire control solution, and that somewhere above him, guns were training onto targets he would never see with his eyes. When the order to open fire came, Miller felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. The 15-inch battery discharged with a concussion that rattled equipment and made his ears ring despite the protection. He kept his eyes on the scope. The returns were unchanged. The Italian ships continued on their course, speed steady, apparently unaware they had just been fired upon. 10 seconds later, the second salvo discharged. This time, Miller noticed something odd. One of the returns flickered, dimmed slightly, then separated into 2 distinct echoes. He reported it immediately. Target echo splitting. Possible hit. In the director control tower, Commander Stannard acknowledged the report. A splitting echo could indicate structural damage, a change in the target's radar cross-section, or the beginning of a list that altered the reflective profile. Whatever the cause, it confirmed what the visual observers were reporting: hits. The fire control solution was accurate. Adjustments were minimal. The next salvo would be on target. Miller continued tracking for another 4 minutes. The returns grew weaker, more confused. One disappeared entirely. Another began to drift, its bearing changing slowly as the ship lost steerage. The third remained stationary, burning. When the ceasefire order came, Miller logged his final observations and stepped back from the scope. His hands were steady. His log was complete. He had tracked 3 enemy ships from detection to destruction. The entire action had lasted less than 15 minutes, and he had never seen any of them. This was the new reality of naval warfare. The battle was fought by men who never saw the enemy. Radar operators in darkened rooms watching green phosphor traces. Fire control computers calculating trajectories for targets they could not observe. gunners loading and firing at invisible ships. The human element remained essential: skill, training, discipline, judgment, but the human eye had become secondary. Electrons saw what humans could not. Machines computed what humans could not calculate quickly enough. The gun crews were still necessary, but they were executing a fire control solution generated by systems that operated beyond the limits of human perception. On the Italian cruisers, the corresponding systems did not exist. Radar operators did not exist because there was no radar. Electronic fire control did not exist because there were no electronic ranging systems integrated into the gunnery solution. The Italians fought as navies had fought for centuries, with eyes, optics, and manual calculations. Against an enemy using the same systems, they would have been competitive. Against an enemy using radar, they were helpless. Pola's fate was sealed, but her crew did not yet know it. The cruiser drifted without power, her engine rooms flooded, her electrical systems dead. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination in some compartments. Damage control teams worked by flashlight, attempting to rig auxiliary pumps and restore partial power. On deck, sailors watched the horizon, waiting for the promised assistance. At 23:30 hours, that assistance arrived. Not Italian destroyers, but British. Jervis and Nubian approached Pola from the south, their searchlights dark, their crews at action stations. The Italian cruiser made no attempt to fight. She could not. Her main battery turrets were frozen in their last bearing, unable to train without electrical power. Secondary guns might still fire manually, but without fire control they were useless at night. A boarding party from Jervis went across. They found Pola's crew assembled on deck, orderly and quiet. The captain, G. de Pisa, surrendered formally. His ship was a wreck. Fires smoldered below decks. The list to starboard was increasing. Flooding was uncontrolled. Even if towed, Pola would likely sink before reaching port. De Pisa requested permission to evacuate his crew. Cunningham granted it. Over the next hour, British destroyers embarked 257 Italian sailors from Pola, including her captain and senior officers. When the evacuation was complete, torpedoes finished the job. Pola sank at 01:30 hours on March 29th. Total British battle damage sustained during the entire night action: 0. Dawn brought assessment. Reconnaissance aircraft from Formidable flew photographic sorties over the battle area. The images showed oil slicks, debris fields, and scattered wreckage, but no intact Italian ships. Zara's stern section remained afloat until mid-morning, when it finally capsized and sank. Fiume was gone. Pola was gone. Destroyers Vittorio Alfieri and Carducci were gone. Total Italian tonnage lost: approximately 23,000 tons. British rescue operations continued through the morning. Destroyers combed the area, picking up survivors wherever they found them. By noon on March 29th, 905 Italian sailors had been rescued. More than 2,300 were dead. The Regia Marina had lost 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers in a single night, without inflicting any damage on the British fleet. It was the worst Italian naval defeat since Lissa in 1866. Cunningham dispatched his report to the Admiralty. The summary was concise: night action off Cape Matapan. Enemy forces engaged and destroyed. Own casualties nil. Churchill read it over breakfast on March 30th and immediately ordered it released to the press. Britain needed victories. Matapan provided one. The Italians announced the loss 2 days later. The communiqué was vague, referring to a severe encounter near Crete, and acknowledging losses in ships and personnel. Internal assessments were more direct. Supermarina's analysis concluded that night fleet actions against radar-equipped opponents were not survivable. Italian heavy units would henceforth avoid night engagements. Convoys to Libya would require German air cover. The balance of power in the central Mediterranean had shifted. For the Regia Marina, Matapan was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a doctrinal collapse. Italian naval planning assumed rough parity in capability. Both sides had battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Both sides had trained crews and modern equipment. Victory or defeat depended on execution. better gunnery, better tactics, better luck. Matapan revealed that the assumption was false. The British did not merely execute better. They operated in a different technological dimension. Italian officers understood optical gunnery. They understood fire control, ballistics, and naval tactics. What they could not understand, because they had no equivalent experience, was fighting against an enemy who saw them when they could not see him. Radar was not a better rangefinder. It was a fundamentally different way of perceiving the battle space. It eliminated the most basic limitation of naval combat: the horizon. With radar, a ship could detect, track, and engage targets at ranges and in conditions that rendered optical systems useless. Post-action interrogations of survivors confirmed the psychological impact. Italian sailors were trained, disciplined, and brave. But bravery has limits when the enemy is invisible. Men could fight what they could see, even if outnumbered or outgunned. They could not fight effectively against shells arriving from an unknown bearing, fired by ships they never glimpsed. The experience was not merely a defeat. It was disorientation, helplessness, and the collapse of every tactical assumption they had been taught. Supermarina reviewed doctrine throughout April 1941. Night fleet operations were effectively suspended. Heavy units would sortie only with extensive air cover and only during daylight hours. Convoy routes were adjusted to minimize exposure to British naval forces. The German Luftwaffe was asked to provide additional reconnaissance and strike assets. Submarine operations intensified to compensate for the reluctance of surface units to engage. None of it addressed the fundamental problem. The British had radar. The Italians did not. Until that gap closed, the Mediterranean night belonged to the Royal Navy. Cunningham understood this immediately. His post-action report, filed on March 30th, devoted 3 pages to radar performance and its tactical implications. He noted that Type 284 had functioned reliably and continuously throughout the engagement, that range accuracy was sufficient for blind fire gunnery, and that integration with the fire control system was seamless. He recommended immediate fitting of surface fire control radar to all capital ships and cruisers, priority installation on units operating in contested waters, and accelerated training for radar operators. More significantly, Cunningham recommended changes to night fighting doctrine. Pre-war Royal Navy tactics assumed that night engagements would be confused, chaotic, and decided primarily by destroyer torpedo attacks supported by searchlight illumination from cruisers. Matapan had demonstrated that radar enabled capital ships to engage effectively at night without illumination, without destroyer support, and without the visual chaos that typically characterized night actions. The implications were profound. If battleships could fight at night as effectively as during the day, then the enemy's ability to escape under the cover of darkness was eliminated. The tactical advantage shifted decisively to the side with radar. The Admiralty circulated Cunningham's report within 10 days. Copies went to all flag officers, to the tactical school, to the gunnery school at Whale Island, and to the Naval Intelligence Division for analysis. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Radar installations were accelerated. Training programs expanded. Doctrine was revised to reflect the new capability. By mid-1941, Royal Navy night fighting doctrine explicitly assumed radar availability and prescribed tactics accordingly. The British did not rest on Matapan's success. Within days, Admiralty analysts began dissecting the action to extract lessons for future engagements. The analysis was systematic and detailed. Radar performance, fire control accuracy, shell expenditure, time to first hit, and communications procedures were all evaluated. The report, designated Mediterranean Fleet Dispatch Number 432/41, was classified secret and distributed to flag officers and gunnery schools throughout the Royal Navy. The key conclusion was unambiguous. Radar-controlled gunnery at night was not experimental. It was operational and decisive. Type 284 had functioned reliably under combat conditions. Range accuracy averaged within 250 yards at 8,000 yards, sufficient for accurate fire control. Bearing accuracy was within 1 degree. Update rate was adequate for targeting slow-moving ships. Problems noted were minor. Interference from own ship transmitters, occasional clutter from sea return, and operator fatigue during extended tracking. None had affected the outcome. Recommendations followed. All capital ships should be fitted with surface fire control radar as a matter of urgency. Gunnery training should include mandatory night firing exercises using radar ranges. Doctrine should explicitly authorize blind fire engagements when radar contact was established and visual contact was not. The principle was simple. If you can measure it, you can hit it. Visibility was no longer a prerequisite for effective gunnery. The United States Navy monitored these developments closely. American observers had been embedded with the Mediterranean Fleet since 1940. They attended the post-Matapan briefings, studied the reports, and forwarded detailed analyses to Washington. The lessons would inform USN radar development and night fighting doctrine throughout the Pacific War. At Guadalcanal in November 1942, American destroyers would use radar-controlled gunnery to engage Japanese surface forces at night, sinking or damaging multiple ships while sustaining minimal damage. At Surigao Strait in October 1944, American battleships would cross the T of a Japanese battle line in darkness, destroying it with radar-directed fire. Matapan provided the proof of concept. Other navies refined the technique. The intelligence windfall from Matapan extended beyond tactical lessons. The 905 rescued Italian sailors included officers, petty officers, and specialists from gunnery, engineering, and communications departments. British interrogators began work immediately. The questioning was systematic and professional. What equipment was aboard Zara and Fiume? What were the standard communications procedures? How were fire control solutions computed? What were the capabilities and limitations of Italian optical rangefinders? What radar equipment, if any, was fitted or planned? The answers confirmed British assessments. Italian fire control was sophisticated but entirely optical. Rangefinders were excellent Galileo and San Giorgio instruments with 3-meter to 5-meter base lengths, capable of accurate ranges to 15,000 yards in good visibility. But they required a visible target. At night, without illumination, they were useless. Italian doctrine recognized this limitation and avoided night surface actions accordingly. The exception had been Matapan, where the need to rescue Pola overrode tactical caution. The result validated Italian pre-war doctrine. Night fleet actions were too risky. Unfortunately, that lesson came at the cost of 3 cruisers. Italian radar development, according to the interrogations, was in early stages. Experimental sets existed, primarily for air search. Surface fire control radar was under discussion but not yet in development. Integration with existing fire control systems was considered a major technical challenge. Projected timeline for operational deployment: 2 to 3 years minimum. This confirmed what British intelligence had suspected. Italy was at least 2 years behind Britain in naval radar technology and possibly further behind in doctrine and training. The interrogations also revealed Italian awareness of British radar. Survivors knew that British ships had detected them before visual contact. Some suspected electronic means, though none could describe the systems in detail. Italian naval intelligence had compiled reports of unusual antennas observed on British warships, rotating arrays, mattress-like structures, and Yagi-style elements, but interpretation was uncertain. Were these radio direction finders? Air search equipment? Something else? The exact capability remained unclear to Italian analysts even after Matapan. This intelligence was immediately actionable. British naval planners now knew that Italian heavy units would avoid night engagements, that Italian radar development was years from operational deployment, and that Italian awareness of British radar capabilities was incomplete. All 3 factors shaped subsequent Mediterranean operations. Convoys were routed to maximize exposure to night interception opportunities. British submarines were positioned along Italian convoy routes with instructions to report contacts for surface interception. Carrier air groups practiced night shadowing procedures to maintain contact until surface units could close for engagement. The strategic initiative in the central Mediterranean tilted heavily toward the Royal Navy. In Rome, the implications were stark. Supermarina's internal assessment, completed in mid-April 1941, acknowledged that Italian heavy units could not contest British control of the central Mediterranean at night. Without radar, the risk of encountering British capital ships in darkness was unacceptable. Future operations would require either daylight-only engagements or overwhelming numerical superiority. Neither condition was likely. The political reaction was muted but real. Mussolini delayed public announcement of the Matapan losses for 48 hours, hoping to soften the blow with simultaneous reports of successes in North Africa. None materialized. Italian newspapers published the communiqué on March 31st, describing a severe engagement near Crete, with losses in ships and personnel. Casualty figures were not released. The scale of the defeat became clear only gradually, as families received notification that their sons, husbands, or brothers were missing. Admiral Angelo Iacchino was not blamed. His decision to detach Zara and Fiume to assist Pola had followed standard doctrine. He could not have anticipated that British battleships were within gun range or that they possessed the ability to engage at night without visual contact. Supermarina's review concluded that the failure was systemic, not individual. Italian naval technology lagged behind British capabilities in one critical area. That gap had cost 3 cruisers and 2,000 lives. Germany offered assistance. The Kriegsmarine had been developing radar for surface vessels since 1938, though progress had been slow and fitful. German sets were intended primarily for fire control aboard capital ships, not for general fleet use. Moreover, German naval priorities lay in the Atlantic, not the Mediterranean. Requests for radar equipment received sympathetic hearings in Berlin but limited material support. The Italians would have to develop their own systems. That would take years. In the interim, Regia Marina operational tempo declined sharply. Major fleet sorties, previously conducted monthly, became rare. Convoy escorts relied increasingly on German air cover. Submarine operations expanded to compensate for the reduced surface threat. The Italian fleet, once a credible opponent, became a fleet in being, powerful on paper, cautious in practice, and increasingly irrelevant to the outcome of the Mediterranean campaign. The German reaction to Matapan was mixed. Kriegsmarine liaison officers in Rome reviewed the action reports with interest and concern. The interest focused on British radar capabilities. If the Royal Navy could engage at night with such effectiveness, similar capabilities might exist in the North Atlantic and North Sea. German surface raiders, already constrained by fuel shortages and Allied air patrols, would face additional risks. The concern focused on Italian combat effectiveness. Germany relied on Italy to contest British control of the Mediterranean, particularly the central basin between Sicily and Libya. If Italian surface forces were now effectively neutralized at night, German logistics to North Africa would become more difficult. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, dispatched a technical mission to Italy in May 1941. The mission's mandate was to assess Italian radar development and recommend areas for German technical assistance. The assessment was discouraging. Italian radar technology lagged German development by approximately 18 months, and German development itself lagged British capabilities by a similar margin. German radar sets intended for surface vessels, primarily the FUMO series, were in limited production and prioritized for capital ships operating in northern waters. Diversion to Italian forces was possible but would reduce German capabilities. Moreover, simply providing equipment would not solve the problem. Effective use of radar required integration with fire control, trained operators, revised doctrine, and extensive fleet exercises. That would take time. The mission recommended limited assistance, sharing of technical documentation, provision of sample equipment for reverse engineering, and training of Italian technicians at German radar schools. Operational radar sets for immediate deployment. None. The Italians would have to develop their own capability. Germany would help, but slowly and conditionally. The Italian Navy was an ally, but German priorities came first. Mussolini received these recommendations with frustration. He understood the strategic implications. Without an effective night fighting capability, Italian heavy units could not contest British control of key sea lanes. That meant British convoys to Malta and Greece would continue. It meant Axis convoys to Libya would remain vulnerable. It meant the Mediterranean War would drag on with no prospect of a decisive Italian naval victory. The promise of modern radar eventually was not helpful. Mussolini needed capability now, not in 2 years. His response was to pressure the Italian electronics industry. Firms including Safar, Marelli, and Fivra were directed to accelerate radar development. Funding increased. Priorities shifted. But industrial capacity was limited, technical expertise was scarce, and the fundamental physics of radar design could not be rushed. Italian engineers produced functional prototypes by late 1941, but these were crude compared to British and German equipment. Range was limited. Reliability was poor. Integration with fire control was incomplete. Operational deployment was repeatedly delayed. By 1942, Italy had still not fielded effective naval radar. The gap identified at Matapan persisted. Italian surface forces continued to avoid night engagements. German air support became essential for convoy protection, and the strategic balance in the Mediterranean remained tilted toward Britain. Matapan's legacy was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a technological failure that shaped Italian naval operations for the remainder of the war. British logistics in the Mediterranean improved markedly after Matapan. Convoy losses to surface attack dropped to near zero. Italian submarines remained a threat, as did German and Italian air power, but the risk of interception by heavy cruisers or battleships was effectively eliminated. Convoy planners routed transports with greater confidence. Supply throughput to Greece and later to Malta increased. The Royal Navy had not won control of the Mediterranean. That would require years and the defeat of the Axis air forces, but it had established control of the night sea lanes. The impact on Axis logistics to North Africa was measurable. Italian convoys to Tripoli and Benghazi sailed under heavy escort, hugging the coast, and moving only during daylight hours when German air cover was available. Transit times increased. Losses to British submarines and aircraft rose. German logistics officers in Libya complained that supply deliveries were erratic and insufficient. Rommel's Africa Corps operated perpetually on the edge of fuel and ammunition shortages. Some of this was due to British interdiction of shipping. Some was due to the collapse of Italian confidence after Matapan. Cause and effect were difficult to separate, but the correlation was clear. After March 1941, the Axis supply situation in North Africa deteriorated steadily. The broader strategic effect was one of confidence. The Royal Navy had suffered defeats in Norway at Dunkirk and in the early Mediterranean campaigns. Matapan was an unambiguous victory, achieved with negligible cost, against a competent and well-equipped enemy. It demonstrated that British technology, tactics, and training could overcome numerical and geographic disadvantages. That lesson mattered in London, where Churchill faced relentless pressure to justify continued commitment to the Mediterranean theater. Matapan provided justification. Churchill exploited the victory fully. His announcement to Parliament on April 1 emphasized the scale of Italian losses and the fact that the Royal Navy had sustained no casualties. The contrast was deliberate. Britain's war in early 1941 was a litany of setbacks. The Blitz, reverses in North Africa, and the fall of Greece. Matapan was good news, and Churchill presented it as evidence that British forces could win decisively when given the tools and opportunity. The propaganda value extended beyond Britain. Allied nations, particularly the United States, not yet formally in the war but increasingly aligned with British interests, followed the battle closely. American naval attaches reported that Matapan demonstrated the effectiveness of radar in surface combat and validated aggressive night fighting tactics. These reports influenced American radar development priorities and reinforced arguments for increased naval construction. If Britain, outnumbered and resource-constrained, could achieve such results with technology and tactics, what might the United States achieve with its vastly larger industrial base? The immediate operational impact was measurable in convoy statistics. In February 1941, before Matapan, British convoys to Greece sailed with heavy escort and accepted substantial risk of surface interception. Average transit time from Alexandria to Piraeus, 4.2 days. Percentage of convoys intercepted by Italian surface units, 12%. Losses to surface action, 3 transports totaling 11,000 tons. In April, after Matapan, the numbers changed. Average transit time, 3.8 days, reflecting more direct routing. Percentage of convoys intercepted by Italian surface units, 0. Losses to surface action, 0. Italian submarines remained active, and Axis air attacks continued, but the threat of surface interception by heavy cruisers or battleships evaporated. Convoy planners routed transports more aggressively, knowing that if Italian heavy units sortied at night, British capital ships could engage with overwhelming advantage. The Axis convoy situation deteriorated correspondingly. Italian convoys to Libya sailed under conditions of increasing risk. British submarines operated freely along the routes. British aircraft from Malta struck with impunity, and the Italian Navy, which should have provided heavy escort, was largely absent. Italian destroyers and light cruisers escorted convoys, but heavy units remained in port or operated only during daylight with extensive air cover. The result was predictable. Convoy losses increased. In March 1941, before Matapan, Italian convoys to Libya achieved a delivery rate of approximately 83%. That is, 83% of cargo loaded in Italian ports reached North African ports intact. In April, the rate dropped to 74%. In May, 68%. By June, 59%. Some of this decline was due to increased British submarine and air activity, but some was due to the Italian Navy's reluctance to commit heavy units to convoy escort, a reluctance born directly from the Matapan experience. German logistics officers in Libya documented the impact. Fuel deliveries fell below consumption rates. Ammunition stockpiles declined. Spare parts became scarce. Rommel's operations in April and May 1941 were constrained not by British resistance but by supply shortages. His own reports to Berlin complained repeatedly that Italian convoy performance was inadequate and that promised shipments were not arriving. The connection to Matapan was indirect but real. Italian naval confidence had been shattered, and that loss of confidence translated into logistics failures that affected German operations hundreds of miles away. The summer of 1941 brought new crises. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June. Japan edged toward war in the Pacific. The Mediterranean became one theater among many, its importance relative rather than absolute. But the lessons of Matapan endured. Radar had transformed naval warfare as fundamentally as the steam engine or the rifled gun. Navies that understood this adapted. Navies that did not were defeated. By 1942, every major British warship carried surface search and fire control radar. Installation priorities focused on capital ships and cruisers, but destroyers and escort vessels received sets as production allowed. Training programs expanded to include radar operation and maintenance. Doctrine evolved to assume radar availability rather than treat it as a special capability. The Royal Navy became a radar-equipped fleet, not merely a fleet with some radar-equipped ships. Other navies followed. The United States Navy accelerated radar development and deployment after Pearl Harbor. American sets, designations SG, SC, and later S-band fire control radars, proliferated across the fleet. By 1943, even destroyer escorts and patrol craft carried search radar. Japanese naval radar development lagged badly. The Kaigun deployed search radar on major units but never achieved effective integration with fire control. The result was predictable. American ships saw first, fired first, and hit first. Japanese night fighting doctrine, once feared throughout the Pacific, became obsolete. By 1944, it was suicidal. The Italian Navy attempted to close the gap. Experimental radar sets were tested aboard cruisers in 1942, but results were disappointing. Range was limited, reliability was poor, and integration with existing fire control systems was incomplete. By the time the technology matured, Italy had withdrawn from the war. The Regia Marina never conducted another major surface action after Matapan. Its final contribution to the war was surrender, delivering its surviving units to Allied ports in September 1943 under the terms of the armistice. Post-war analysis confirmed what participants had known immediately. Matapan was a proof-of-concept engagement. The technology was new, the doctrine was evolving, and the outcome was uncertain. But the result was decisive. 3 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers were destroyed. Over 2,000 men were killed. 0 British casualties. The numbers spoke for themselves. The human cost was real and lasting. Italian naval casualties in the Mediterranean exceeded 12,000 over the course of the war. Matapan accounted for nearly 20% of that total in a single night. For the families of the men who died, the strategic implications were irrelevant. Sons, brothers, husbands were gone. Many had no grave. The Mediterranean took them, and the sea kept them. For the survivors, memory was complicated. Italian sailors who lived through Matapan carried the knowledge that they had fought bravely in a battle they could not win. Their ships were well built. Their training was thorough. Their courage was not in question. But courage could not overcome the fundamental disadvantage of fighting blind against an enemy who could see. That knowledge shaped their testimony, their post-war reflections, and their understanding of what technology meant in modern war. The British remembered Matapan as a victory, but also as a lesson. Radar had worked. Doctrine had worked. Integration of technology, training, and leadership had produced the desired outcome. But the margin between success and failure was narrower than it appeared. Radar operators had functioned under pressure. Fire control systems had not failed. Communications had remained clear. Any one of those elements breaking down might have changed the outcome. Success was not inevitable. It was engineered. By 1946, radar was ubiquitous in Western navies. The sets were smaller, lighter, more reliable, and more capable than the experimental equipment fitted to Warspite in 1941. Fire control integration was seamless. Operators were trained to peacetime proficiency standards that exceeded wartime performance. The revolution that began at Matapan was complete. Blind fire gunnery was not exceptional. It was routine. The historical section of the British Naval Intelligence Division summarized the lesson in 1946. Cape Matapan demonstrated that electronic perception confers decisive advantage in surface action. Those who see first strike first. Technology shapes tactics. Tactics determine outcomes. That conclusion, written in measured bureaucratic language, understated the transformation. Matapan did not merely demonstrate an advantage. It marked the end of one era of naval warfare and the beginning of another. For 400 years, naval battles had been decided by courage, seamanship, gunnery, and tactics. All of those remained important. But after Matapan, they were not sufficient. The side with better sensors would win. The side without them would lose. That was the lesson, and it remains true today. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.